The sun hung low and merciless over Arroyo Seco, bleeding the sky the color of old blood. Dust devils spun between the warped boardwalks and the sagging false fronts of the saloons, and every boot that struck the street kicked up a fine yellow, haze that clung to skin and tongue alike. Caleb Harlan sat his buckskin gelding at the edge of the crowd, reins loose in one gloved hand, the other resting on the horn of his saddle. He had not come for the spectacle. He had come for salt and a new cinch strap. But the auction block had drawn half the town the way a fresh carcass draws flies. A woman stood on the planks. She wore a faded blue dress that had once been fine, the hem torn where it had dragged across miles of rail and stage. Her hair, the color of dry prairie grass, had come unpinned in places, strands stuck to the sweat on her neck. She kept her eyes on the horizon, not on the men who shouted numbers at her. That stillness caught Caleb harder than any scream would have. $20, Jeb Whitaker bawled from beside the block, thumbs hooked in his vest. The saloon keeper's face was red from heat and whiskey. She's a mail-order bride, gentlemen, contracted fair and square to poor old Tom McCade before the Lord took him. Now Tom's debts fall on her. 25. A deputy laughed. Sheriff Briggs leaned against the jailhouse porch, arms folded, watching with the lazy interest of a man who already knew how the ledger would balance. Caleb knew the look. He had seen it on men who burned homesteads for sport. The bids climbed to 30, then 35. A ranch hand named Ruiz spat tobacco and raised his hand again. The woman, Abigail Langston, someone had called her, closed her eyes for a single breath. When she opened them, the fear was still there, but so was something else, a quiet refusal to beg. Caleb nudged the buckskin forward. Leather creaked. The crowd parted enough for him to reach the block. 50, he said. His voice was low, rough from disuse. Heads turned. Whitaker's mouth opened, then closed. Briggs straightened off the porch rail. Harlan, the sheriff, drawled, "You fixing to start keeping house again?" Caleb did not answer. He counted out the coins, every last one he carried from selling 2 yearlings in Las Cruces, and laid them in Whitaker's palm. The metal was warm. The saloon keeper counted twice, then shrugged and handed over a folded paper that smelled of ink and desperation. Abigail stepped down. Her boots were too thin for the desert. She looked at Caleb once, measuring him the way a trapped animal measures, a new cage. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "you're free to go wherever the stage runs. Or you can come with me to the ranch. There's work if you want it. No strings." She studied the dust between them. "I have. Nowhere else," he nodded once. That was enough. They rode out of town at dusk, her behind him on the buckskin, arms loose around his waist because there was nothing else to hold. The desert cooled quickly. Coyotes yipped in the distance. Caleb felt the press of her cheek against his back and wondered why it did not feel like trespass. He had not carried another living soul since the night the Comancheros came. His ranch lay in a shallow bowl of land where the Pecos River bent like a broken bow. Adobe walls, a corral of twisted cedar, a low barn that still smelled of the fire, that had taken the original roof 3 years earlier. He had rebuilt it alone. No hands, no wife, only the wind and the memory of 2 graves under the cottonwoods. He showed her the spare room off the kitchen. A rope bed, a washstand, a single window that looked south toward the mountains. "Supper's beans and salt pork," he said. "I ain't much of a cook." She set her small carpetbag on the floor. "I can do better." He left her to it, the eye. First week passed in silence mostly. She rose before dawn, boiled coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, and set biscuits on the table without being asked. Caleb ate, nodded, went out to mend fence or doctor a lame mare. At night, he sat on the porch with a cigarette and listened to her move inside the house. Soft footsteps, the clink of a plate, the hush when she paused at the window. Sometimes he caught her watching him across the yard, but she always looked away first. He did not ask about Boston or the man who had sent for her and then died of lung fever before she stepped off the stage. She did not ask about the two small crosses under the cottonwoods. Some things were too heavy for questions. On the 8th night, a storm rolled down from the Sangre de Cristos. Lightning split the sky and rain hammered the tin roof like grape shot. Caleb sat at the table cleaning his Colt, the lamp guttering. Abigail stood in the doorway in her nightdress, arms crossed against the chill. "You're going to wear that. Pistol out," she said. He did not look up. "It's kept me alive." She crossed the room and poured herself coffee from the pot he had left on the stove. "I watched you pay $50 for a woman you don't know. Most men would have taken more than biscuits in return." Caleb snapped the cylinder shut. The sound was loud in the rain. "I ain't most men." "No," she said quietly. "You're not." She sat across from him. The lamplight caught the hollows under her eyes. For the first time he saw the bruise on her wrist, faint but unmistakable, shaped like fingers. Whitaker's grip, probably, when they hauled her off the stage. He set the Colt down. "That hurt?" She turned the wrist so the bruise faced the wall. "It's nothing." He reached across the table anyway, slow, the way you approach a spooked horse, and touched 2 fingers to the mark. She did not flinch. The rain drummed on. After a long minute, she turned her hand and let her palm rest against his. Calluses met calluses. Neither of them spoke. When the storm slackened, they went to their separate rooms, but something in the house had shifted, like a gate left unlatched. The next morning he found her in the barn, doctoring the mare's foreleg, with a poultice of mesquite leaves and lard. The horse stood quiet under her hands. Caleb leaned on the stall door and watched. "You got away with them," he said. "I had horses back home, before everything." He waited. She kept working. "My father lost the livery stable to the bank. I answered the advertisement because Tom McCade promised land and a roof. When I got here, they told me he was already in the ground, and his debts were mine. Sheriff Briggs said I could work it off in the saloon upstairs." Her voice stayed even, but her fingers trembled once. "I told him no." Caleb felt the old rage stir, the one that had lived in his chest since the night he came home to Ash, and 2 bodies. He pushed it down. "Briggs don't speak for this ranch." She looked up at him then. "Why did you buy me out?" He thought about lying. Instead, he told the truth. "You looked like somebody who didn't belong on that block." She studied him a long time. "And you? Who do you belong to, Caleb Harlan?" The question landed like a stone in still water. He walked out of the barn without answering. 3 days later, Sheriff Briggs rode in with 2 deputies and a warrant written on the back of a saloon tab. The buckskins stamped in the corral. Abigail stood on the porch steps, apron dusted with flour, a rolling pin in her hands like a club. Briggs tipped his hat. "Harlan, we come to collect the woman. Contract's still binding in the eyes of the law." Caleb stepped out of the barn, rifle loose in the crook of his arm. "Eyes of what law?" "The one that says debts get paid." Briggs smiled without warmth. "You interfered with commerce, son. That's a $100 fine, or the girl, your choice." Caleb spat in the dust. "She ain't commerce." One deputy shifted his hand toward his holster. Abigail's knuckles went white on the rolling pin. Caleb said, "You boys ride on back to town. Tell Whitaker the debt's settled. Tell him I'll burn the saloon down before I let him touch her." Briggs laughed once, short and ugly. "You always were a fool about women, Harlan. First one got you 2 graves. This one gonna get you 6 feet of your own." The words landed clean. Caleb felt them go in like a knife between the ribs. He did not. "I'll raise the rifle." He only looked at the sheriff until the man's smile faltered. "Get off my land," Caleb said. They left. But the dust they raised hung in the air long after. That night he could not sleep. He walked out to the cottonwoods and stood between the 2 small crosses. The moon was thin. He spoke to the dirt the way he had not spoken to anyone in 3 years. "I keep thinking I should have been here. I keep thinking if I'd just come home one day sooner." Footsteps behind him. Abigail stopped at the edge of the trees. She carried a lantern low so the light did not blind. "I didn't mean to follow," she said. He did not turn. "It's all right." She came closer. The lantern hissed. "I lost my mother when I was 12. Cholera. I used to sit by her grave and talk to her like she could still hear. Sometimes I think she could." Caleb's throat closed. He swallowed once, hard. "They took everything. I rebuilt the house. I can't rebuild them." She set the lantern on the ground. Then she did something he did not expect. She stepped in front of him and placed both hands on his chest, right over the scar where a Comanchero bullet had clipped him years ago. Through the cotton shirt, he felt the steady beat of her palms. "You're still here," she said. "That's not nothing." He covered her hands with his own. They stood like that until the lantern burned low, and the night grew cold enough that their breath showed. After that, the days changed shape. She taught him how to make sourdough that did not taste like saddle leather. He taught her how to load a Winchester and where the best grays lay in the high pasture. They spoke less, but the silence felt different, companionable, like two people walking the same fence line. Once, when a late frost killed half the garden, she cried without sound in the dirt. He knelt beside her and brushed soil from her cheek with his thumb. Neither mentioned it later. The trouble came at the end of the month. They were branding calves in the south pasture when 3 riders appeared on the ridge. Briggs was not among them. These were hard men, Whitaker's cousins from up near Rayton, the kind who rode for money and left bodies where they fell. Caleb saw the rifles before the horses cleared the mesquite. He told Abigail to get behind the chuck wagon. She went, but she took the spare pistol from the wagon box. The first rider called down, "Harlan, Whitaker wants the girl and his money back. You can keep the ranch if you're smart." Caleb levered around into the Winchester. "I ain't smart." Shooting started. It was short and ugly. One cousin went down with a leg wound. Caleb took a graze across the ribs that burned like fire. Abigail fired once from behind the wagon. Clean, steady, and clipped the second rider's shoulder. The third man wheeled his horse and fled. When the dust settled, Caleb sat on the ground holding his side. Blood seeped between his fingers. Abigail knelt and tore a strip from her petticoat with her teeth. Her hands shook only a little. "You damn fool," she said, voice cracking. "You could have let them take me." "No," he said. "I couldn't." She pressed the cloth to the wound. Their faces were close. He smelled flour and wood smoke on her skin. She looked at him the way she had looked at the horizon that first day, measuring, deciding. "I was supposed to be somebody's wife," she whispered. "I never expected to be somebody's reason." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers left a smear of blood on her cheek. "You healed what I thought was past healing," he said. "Figured it was time I did something worth a damn in return." She laughed once, a small broken sound, and kissed him. It tasted of salt and iron and the long quiet between them. They buried no one that day. The wounded riders limped back to town. Sheriff Briggs disappeared 2 nights later. Some said he crossed into Mexico with Whitaker's strongbox. The town did not mourn either man. Caleb and Abigail stood on the porch the evening the first autumn chill came down. The cottonwoods had begun to turn. She wore one of his old shirts, sleeves rolled high. He had his arm around her waist, thumb tracing the scar the bullet had left on his own side. "You still owe me $50, she said, teasing. He smiled, rare enough that it felt like sunrise after long dark. "I'll pay it in years if you'll let me." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I'll take the years." Far off, a hawk rode the thermals above the river. The land stretched wide and empty, and theirs. Somewhere behind them the house creaked in the wind, 2 rooms now warm with the same fire. They did not speak of love the way people in books did. They simply stood together, watching the light leave the desert, and that was enough.